This is the end, beautiful friend.
Welcome to this discussion on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. We'll be joined with my friend Leanna Anderson from the English department in just a little bit to discuss this text. I wanted to introduce this episode by going through some of the themes of Heart of Darkness and to put this text into some of its historical context. So starting with the title, just to depict some of the themes, it's important to really understand what this book is getting at. It's a critical book to understand and to better understand the world we live in today and to better understand ourselves as we are immersed in the trappings of civilization. Heart of Darkness, the title of itself is a binary opposition. So you have the heart on one hand, which implicates love and positivity, where darkness indicates negativity and hate and emptiness. And it's important to notice too that it's not the heart of darkness, right? There's no definite article there. That it suggests that the heart of darkness doesn't belong to anyone. It's vacant. It's this energy that permeates every heart and can cause untold damage if it's not kept in check. And so the book is basically the summary of the book going through the lens of these themes is basically looking at the center of all evil and suffering and sorrow, the center of darkness, the center of the unknown, a vacuum where love cannot exist. And putting this book in context, right? This book is basically taking place on a boat in the Thames River in London, where these group of guys are waiting for the tide to go out, and the character Marlow is telling of his time and his adventures in the Congo. And he's basically sharing the sentiment that Africa was known as this dark continent, as most of it was unknown. It was vacant, right? Like the heart of darkness indicates. It was a vacant land and it didn't seem to belong to anyone. Europe invaded and inflicted the regimes, causing Africans to suffer all sorts of brutal consequences. Christians believed they were bringing light in civilization to Africans. So you'll see lots of depictions in this book of missionaries that are there to uplift these people and to bring them Christ into their lives. Because to them, Africans were seen as sexually promiscuous. They were basically a barbaric nation of savages, shameless, unknowledgeable. So they're bringing this Christian love to them to uplift them. However, the means of which they're doing that is to create a colony and understand what a colony is. A colony is dedicated to extracting the resources through every brutal means necessary to enrich a few individuals. So Marlow isn't there to enrich himself necessarily. He is there for an adventure, a journey to kind of maybe find himself, I suppose. I'm not sure. To discover something about him, or perhaps the Congo, and or both. And what we need to understand is that this book is couched in historical events, and why so many Europeans are going there to colonize the Congo has to do with this one individual, King Leopold II, the King of Belgium. And so he procures the Congo through the Berlin Conference in the 1880s. And he does so, this is at a time, it's important to understand this is a time when Europe is becoming self-conscious of itself. Slavery has been outlawed, and there is a conversation that naked imperialism is beneath the greater goals of the Enlightenment project, right? We're not there just to extract resources and to enslave people for the sake of enriching a few. We are there to bring light to the dark places of the world, to bring them Christianity, to bring them civilization, education, state-run institutions, all of that kind of stuff. And so at the Berlin Conference, you just have a group of guys basically tied to powerful institutions, wealthy themselves, who spin this yarn that they are going to create this colony and King Leopold will oversee its proceedings, to help these people, which is, there's nothing to the sort. But that quote up there kind of gives light to that. So that's a quote from King Leopold. The Congo state is certainly not a business. If it gathers ivory of some on its lands, that is only to lessen its deficits, unquote. So what he's saying there is, yeah, there's some ivory there, and yeah, there'll be some money made, but that's really there just to pay the administrative costs of the Congo as we are uplifting these poor people who are void of civilization. So here is the Congo. This is a little bit after the time period that we're looking at, 1908 to 1960. But just want to give you a sense of how large of a land it is, right? So it's in Central Africa. It's huge. To give you some more context of how big it is, here it is overlaid over the continent of Europe. It takes over 2/3 of the continent of Europe. So we're talking about a huge tract of land for the taking for these people to go in and exploit it, right? And much of this book takes place on the Congo River. So let's read this quote from the character Marlow in this book. But there was in it one river, especially a mighty big river that you could see on the map, resembling an immense snake uncoiled, with its head in the sea, its body at rest, curving afar over a vast country, and its tail lost in the depths of the land. And as I looked at the map of it in a shop window, it fascinated me as a snake would a bird, a silly little bird. Then I remembered there was a big concern, a company of trade on that river. Dash it all, I thought to myself. They can't trade without using some kind of craft on that lot of fresh water. Steamboats. Why shouldn't I why shouldn't I try to get charge of one? I went along Fleet Street, but could not shake off the idea. The snake had charmed me. So what's going on in this quote is quite interesting. So Conrad, he's a brilliant writer. He's using very sophisticated imagery to construct a vast image of the Congo for the readers to picture. So the use of a snake reinforces this theme of darkness. This is because, as you might guess, snakes resemble evil, right? And oftentimes they're poisonous. So this provokes an image of the Congo being a dangerous place under attack, as snakes are well-known predators. Because of this, the Congo seems inferior because it's vulnerable due to the snake taking over the Congo. The quote describing the river, quote, resembling an immense snake uncoiled, unquote, portrays the snake is alert and is slowly taking over the Congo as it's uncoiling itself, and as it makes its way. The snake is extended in its hunt, and it's inferring that what the snake represents is Belgium, or maybe even King Leopold, and it's going to take over the whole Congo. And so that metaphor that Marlow is evoking here, the character Marlow, the snake has charmed me, is an obvious biblical reference to Adam and Eve when they were tricked by the serpent to commit the original sin. So this story reiterates the point of the snake being cunning, which implies that the Congo would charm and change anyone that comes into contact with it. The biblical reference foreshadows the idea of the Belgium Europeans bringing light, which would represent civilization, Christianity, knowledge, and everything that went with it, being brought from Europe to the Congo as Leopold himself is introducing these great institutions to these poor, uncivilized people. So again, they are there to exploit the resources, and the two resources that they're going to be exploiting in the Congo are ivory and rubber trees. So rubber trees are being planted, vast rubber tree plantations are being planted, and there's lots of money to be made. So here you see Congolese who have gathered these tusks, ripped them out of dead elephants along with their European overseers. Here you have another picture just depicting what is going on in the Congo at this time. Right. And here is the whole point of it, right? Just fashion it into kind of household goods, jewelry, chess pieces, false teeth, piano keys, and dominoes. Dominoes is alluded to in the beginning of the book as they're waiting on the boat for the tide to go out. Marlow explains the accountant had brought out already a box of dominoes and was toying architecturally with the bones, right, stacking them up here and there, right? So early on in the book, kind of a throwaway line. He's just sort of putting out there how pervasive ivory was in Europe as this consumable good. Europeans thought ivory was this kind of exotic thing that obviously there's no elephants in Europe. And so it's this thing out of the darkness of Africa. And it's, as you see there, incredibly malleable. You could shape it into almost anything. So let's take a look at the human cost of what we're talking about here. Because even though Joseph Conrad does, from time to time, point out the brutality, he really doesn't depict these people as human beings who are suffering, right? And here we have untold suffering. This is a father who is staring at the hand and foot of his 5-year-old. The hand and foot was severed as a punishment for him failing, quote unquote, to make the daily rubber quota. Right. And the cutting off of hands, it's very pervasive. It's happening all the time to people who, quote unquote, fail to do good work for their overseers. Right. Here's some more pictures of it. Terrible stuff. I mean, this is what we're talking about here, right? So just to explain what that father was enduring, he hadn't made his rubber quota for the day, so the Belgian appointed overseer had cut off his daughter's hand and foot. Her name was Bolie. She was 5 years old. Then they killed her. So they cut off her hand and foot while she was alive, and then they killed her. But they weren't finished. Then they killed his wife too. And because that didn't seem quite cruel enough, quite strong enough to make their case, they cannibalized both Bolie and her mother. And they presented Nisla with the tokens. Nisla is the father. And the tokens are this bogus currency that they're giving the Congolese who are doing all of this work. The leftovers from the once living body of his darling child whom he so loved. His life was destroyed. They had partially destroyed it anyway by forcing his servitude, but this act finished it for him. All of this filth had occurred because one man who lived thousands of miles across the sea, one man who couldn't get rich enough, had decreed that this land was his and that these people should serve his own greed. Leopold had not given any thought to the idea that these African children, these men and women, were our fully human brothers, created equally by the same hand that had created his own lineage of European royalty. So, yeah, Leopold never steps foot in the Congo. He is very much like a modern day CEO living somewhere perhaps like in London or Chicago, New York, who never steps foot in Indonesia, China, Central America, where their factories are located that are exploiting and brutalizing workers for our consumable goods today, just so they could live in absolute opulence and pleasure at a great expense. So just to go back to this picture, I'm a father, I have children. I can't imagine what this man is enduring. This photo captures it well, but yeah, I really, I'm at a loss for words. And obviously, this is just something that human beings tend to do, but we can kind of pass it off like this. This is an age-old story of history, but it needs to be said it's not necessary. This is the result of maldistributions of wealth, when a few people have most of the wealth of society and use that wealth only to their own ends and as a means to only gather more and more wealth without any kind of democratic constraints on their power and on their greed. Right? This is what capitalism looks like when there are no individual rights, when capital is the sole motivating force for organizing and developing a civilization. So before we are joined with Leanna, I wanted to finish off with this quote here. So in this quote, Conrad is, through Marlow, is explaining his firsthand experiences. And so this quote I'm about to read is depicting a group of laborers who are overseen by an armed African guard constructing a railway to solidify King Leopold II's control over the vast Congo region he was awarded at the Berlin Conference, where no African representatives were obviously present. So initially, Conrad or Marlow believed in Leopold II's philanthropic intentions in the Congo. However, his perspective is going to be drastically shifted after his time there. So let me read through the quote, and I'll talk a little bit more after about what this quote implies here. A slight clinking behind me made me turn my head. 6 black men advanced in a file, toiling up the path. They walked erect and slow, balancing small baskets full of earth on their heads, and the clinking kept time with their footsteps. Black rags were round their loins, and the short ends behind waggled to and fro like tails. I could see every rib. The joints of their limbs were like knots in a rope. Each had an iron collar on his neck, and all were connected together with a chain whose bight swung between them, rhythmically clinking. Another report from the cliff made me think suddenly of that ship of war I had seen firing into a continent. It was the same kind of ominous voice, but these men could by no stretch of the imagination be called enemies. They were called criminals, and the outraged law, like the bursting shells, had come to them, an insoluble mystery from the sea. All their meager breasts panted together, the violently dilated nostrils quivered, the eyes stared stonily uphill. They passed me within 6 inches without a glance, with the complete death-like indifference of unhappy savages. Behind the raw matter, one of them reclaimed the product of the new force at work, strolled despondently, carrying a rifle by its middle. And it's interesting, his language, its middle, not his middle. He had a uniform jacket with a one button off, and seeing a white man on the path, he's referring to himself, hoisted his weapon to his shoulder. This was simple prudence, white men being so much alike at a distance that he could not tell who I might be. He was speedily reassured with a large white rascally grin, and a glance at his charge seemed to take me into partnership in his exalted trust. After all, I was part of the great cause of these high and just proceedings. So that final line, I was also part of the great and high and just proceedings, reveals a deep sense of irony and self-reproach on Conrad's part there, or Marlow, the character's part. The phrase high and just proceedings is used ironically to highlight the injustice and brutality of the entire colonial project. And so we do see Conrad depicting the suffering of these people. With that line, they walked erect and slow about, where is that? The short ends. I could see every rib. The joints of their limbs were like knots in a rope, right? So these people are malnourished. They're being basically worked to death. But there's a lot more detail that we need to be aware of. And so this is an account of a Congolese woman who was suffering quite similarly to these characters in this story. So the quote is, "We were all busy in the fields when a messenger arrived in the village saying that a large group of men was arriving and that many white men were with them. 3 or 4 went to our house and grabbed me, also my husband Alika and my sister Contiga. We were dragged to the road and tied with ropes around our necks. We were all crying because we knew we would be taken to be slaves. We left walking very quickly. My sister Contiga had her baby in her arms, but my husband Alika was forced to carry a goat. We had nothing to eat because the soldiers didn't give us anything. On the 5th day, the soldiers took my sister's baby and threw it on the grass, leaving it to die, and made her carry some pots. On the 6th day, we were very weak due to lack of food and walking constantly. And my husband, who was walking behind us with the goat, sat next to the track and refused to walk any more. The soldiers beat him, but he still refused to move. Then one of them hit him in the head with the tip of the gun, and he fell to the ground. One of the soldiers grabbed the goat, while 2 or 3 others stuck the long knives they put on the tip of the guns on my husband. I saw the blood gushing, and then I didn't see it anymore because we passed by the top of a hill, and it was out of sight." So we get to see here what we're dealing with here, the complete disregard of life. We get to see this family completely destroyed. And this is a family, just like any family. This is a family that you have, right? And this is a depiction of a father that is completely broken by the situation that he finds himself in, and a true depiction of this heart of darkness that Conrad is explaining to us, where love is not to be found within the people that are inflicting such brutality. So I'll leave this introduction here. We're about to be joined by Leanna. And yeah, let's just take pause to really understand through the discussion of what we're talking about here. The Congo within 10 years saw nearly 10 million people die, right? Die of just executions, of having the complications of probably having their arms, their hands and their feet cut off, starvation, being worked to death. And this is something that is not widely known by many people, right? This should be just as familiar as many of us are familiar with the Nazi Holocaust, where we saw tens of millions of people killed during World War II. And the fact that we don't know about this is very telling, and also reveals this heart of darkness that Conrad was pointing us to take a look at, the heart of darkness from without and the heart of darkness from within. Okay, well, welcome, Leanna. Let's go ahead and get started. We are continuing our discussion on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, in which yeah, how's it going? In which I actually noticed the other day, and I'm going to talk about this in the introduction I'm going to put in, but I noticed that the article "the" is not put into the title. Found that very interesting, but that's sort of an aside. But I wanted to start off our discussion by looking at the Enlightenment. And it sort of dawned on me as I was revisiting this book. I was focused on some of the glaring themes of this book: colonialism, the patriarchy, accumulation of wealth, power. But it dawned on me that this is also, and quite obviously so, an indictment on the Enlightenment, right? And so, for any of our students out there that might be viewing this, and if you're unfamiliar with the Enlightenment, briefly, the Enlightenment was a philosophical political movement that came out of Europe, much of which our founding documents in the United States are based on, primarily from one of the most preeminent philosophers of that time period. And the time period we're talking about is the 17th and the 18th century, John Locke, right? And to try to humbly capture what the Enlightenment was in just a few sentences, it's really a intellectual attack on not necessarily hierarchies, but essentialized hierarchies. This idea that if you were born in royalty or of the clergy, you were entitled to the wealth and to the power of that society just based on your condition of birth. And so the Enlightenment is challenging that very notion, right? And that very notion leads to the concept of divine right of king. And so it is pushing back against that, and it's having a difficult time in Europe to kind of entrench itself to the degree of really changing anything. But the United States, or in colonial America, it given the fact that colonial America lacked certain hierarchies that entrench state power, it flourishes in the United States. And one of the things that the Enlightenment really put forward, that I think the Heart of Darkness is shining a spotlight on, is the worth of the individual and its relationship to society and its relationship to institutions. And so on the face of it, the Enlightenment is something we should value, we should treasure, we should preserve. But just like anything, there's always different dimensions to these things that have a cost. So even in one of our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, which is really putting forward that argument that the worth of the individual, the dignity of the individual, is paramount to the interest of the state, and the power of the state. And the state needs certain democratic constraints to protect the individual, right? And so, like in the Declaration of Independence, we have an inalienable right, supposedly, for the pursuit of happiness. And that is a very ambivalent, inalienable right. What do we mean by happiness? What do we mean by that pursuit? And what I find striking about the Heart of Darkness is we're really looking at individuals who are trying to anchor that sense of individualism, some sort of identity. And the problems with that is their identity is pegged on all of the glaring themes of the Heart of Darkness: colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, and the costs are endless to, well, particularly to the people living in the Congo. They're being brutalized, they're being enslaved, they're being killed by the millions. And so I thought we would just talk, if there's anything you could add, is there anything that jumps out at you from the Heart of Darkness that points to how this is really an indictment against the promises and the ideals of the Enlightenment?
Well, first of all, I would say that Heart of Darkness comes kind of as a comment on this age of reason, age of the Enlightenment, because symbolically, of course, the Enlightenment emphasizes this difference between darkness, obscurantism, which was attributed to the age of where religion or church and state were empowered together, hand in hand, for hundreds of years in history, right? So the age of reason claimed to bring people into the light of reason. So then there was a big emphasis on rationality, on science, part of which is, of course, it contributed a lot to the progress of humanity and ideas and science. But at the same time, there was an obsession to quantify everything, to demonstrate that everything is understandable through science. And this is, I mean, colonialism used this infatuation with reason and science to actually justify some of what they were doing there, especially if you think that racism was given a new um, basis or foundation for its existence or justification, which was the rational side of it. So they were trying very hard to prove that Africans were inferior by because they are an inferior species. So because Darwin was becoming popular, the explanation of the differences between species, and so they just took that opportunity to try to prove scientifically, supposedly through phrenology, which was a fake science, that Africans are somewhere between monkey and monkey and human. And they would prove that with drawings of skulls, that they would show how the skull of the African person is much different than the ideal, which is the white um, race. So so yeah, they use this supposed reason and science to show, to add to their already existing idea that, of course, Christianity helped them do that too, but now they added what they thought was undeniable proof through science. And so Conrad is ambivalent in his own way because he still lived in that time period and still was kind of informed by the philosophy of the Enlightenment himself. And if you notice, the title of the book is Heart of Darkness, which is, of course, the references to the contrast between light and darkness, light being associated with civilization just from the very beginning of the book, where we have the river described as full of light. And then we go to the dark river, which is the one that is compared to a snake, which is the one in Africa in the heart of darkness. So, and it's Chinua Achebe, the African writer who wrote a book in response to Heart of Darkness, who made who had a very harsh criticism on Conrad based on this idea that Africa is just a backdrop of white people discovering themselves through going back in time almost. So he said, well, Africa is just a place of darkness because that's convenient narrative for white people. But it's not. I don't believe that it's true that Conrad is completely on the side of, or is trying to actually reinforce the philosophy of the Enlightenment. I think he himself is, in fact, probably through self-exploration, through writing this book, um, he realizes that the darkness is in every human being and not depending on the color of one's skin. Because by the end of the book, we realize that the darkest thing that he finds in the jungle is Kurtz, who is the epitome of Europeans, and he's described as a genius and as an enlightened person. So this emissary of light, as he's called through the book by other people, he is the darkest human that Marlow encounters. So when he returns to England, he realizes that the darkness is everywhere because it never was separated based on geography or race. It's our ability to be evil or to let to let go of our pretense of civilization and give in to our darkest tendencies, like Kurtz does in the jungle. So, in fact, I think Conrad does, in the end, bring a harsh criticism to this colonial, to colonialism in general, and also to those who defend it through supposed science, by showing that darkness is something in all of us, and it's up to us to let it out or not. So we can, you can say that Conrad is contrasting light and darkness, but not in the sense that we initially think, and Achebe and other critics think that that the contrast is racial mostly, but in fact it's in the choices that people make, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it does seem like the Enlightenment kind of unmoored the individual from the constraints of societal institutions, which, given the time period, divine right of king, any wealth anyone enjoyed was at the grace of the king and those connected to the court is understandable, but it does seem the consequences of if the individual is paramount and is unconstrained by any type of institutions that keep society together and can express humanity for humane reasons. Yeah, we get characters like Kurtz who can express his individuality in any way that he sees fit, in ways that we'll probably be discussing as we go forward. So,
but I also wanted to add one thing that you mentioned is this emphasis on work as a way for individuals to give themselves an identity within this philosophy of the Enlightenment, or the age of the Enlightenment, and it's very telling that part of what Marlow observes, and it's not something that he himself espouses, but what he observes there is that work is supposed to bring Africans out of their darkness, out of their ignorant ways, right? So through work, and they're put to work. And also his explaining that the British Empire, European empires really pride themselves on being very efficient, as opposed to the brute force of the Roman Empire. So this efficiency means that you use other people for your own purposes. Basically, this is what's behind this enlightened way of employing Africans, is basically killing them by exploiting them and putting them to work and not giving them much in return, except, I mean, and I'm going to use a quote where it's revealed that the pay that the natives are given is wire and other ridiculous things that people consider, or the Europeans considered, a fair trade. So they were getting enormously rich off of the work of these people that, if they didn't agree to work, they would be tortured. Their arms would be chopped off, or hands would be chopped off, and things like that. So supposedly work was ennobling them, but in fact it was a pillage of their country, of their territory, because I guess country is our definition of it. But anyway, the place where they lived is pillaged, is raped. They are forced to work based on a law that is not theirs, based on a civilization that is not theirs, and their own civilization is destroyed in the process. They have to kind of pick up the pieces afterward, or not necessarily after the fact. But in Chinua Achebe's book Things Fall Apart, this is what he's talking about. Things fall apart due to the presence of the Europeans, and the people who survive are those who adapt, who pick up the pieces and are able to put them together. The main metaphor in Things Fall Apart is a tortoise with a broken shell that is put back together. So it's a way for Chinua Achebe to kind of comment on the fact that, yes, when cultures clash, and this is a clash of cultures, right, and one dominates over the other one has two choices: either disappear or adapt, create a different shell to protect your own identity, and just move on with the new identity that is a combination of the old one and a new one. But yeah, to return to Heart of Darkness, I do recommend Fall Apart as a good counterpoint to Heart of Darkness.
Yeah, and for any student that's coming across this is unfamiliar with the verse that Leanna is referring to, Chinua Achebe, he wrote a book called Things Fall Apart, which was basically a response to some of the shortcomings that he viewed that were in the Heart of Darkness. And mainly, Joseph Campbell is not really humanizing the natives or the cannibals or the criminals, which are actual human beings, Congolese, who had lived in this area for millennia that are now being brutalized. Yeah, real quick, you mentioned that I think one of the major key words that he's pointing at, efficiency, which really points to how this is an indictment on the Enlightenment, right? I don't want to get too political here, but we are seeing this devotion to efficiency with the Doge cuts, right? And so on paper, if you're trying to, square the spreadsheet, it might make sense to cut things like cancer research for children, or cut back on the amount of processing centers for Social Security, right? It's all in the name of efficiency, without looking at efficiency and going, where is the balance between being fiscally responsible, trying to maximize profits, to the needs of actual human beings that live amongst us.
That's
But
what gets lost in the numbers, right?
mhm,
Human lives. So that's what Conrad also emphasizes, that the humanity of the people that are being quantified like that, and in the name of efficiency, their lives are lost. Their humanity is lost. Basically, it's a process of dehumanization through forcing, I guess, people into numbers, and then showing numbers to say, look what the work we've done, right? So it's an interesting comparison. I haven't thought about it, but um, it's a sinister way to look at what is still happening today. How people try very hard to kind of reduce humanity to tables and to numbers
yeah, it's troubling.
and money, of course.
Yeah. Do you want me to bring up one of the
Um,
quotes, starting with the
yeah,
voice of the surf? Or
can you share? I mean, I could share that. I think I have the same document, but you can put it up if it's easier.
yes, let's do that right now. There we go. So that should be, we should be able to see that
Okay.
now.
So,
Yeah, if you wanted to share this quote and then talk about what we should be keeping in mind based on this quote.
so just to give a little background, so this is where Marlow, he he really wanted to go on an adventure in Africa. So he's not really his own impetus to go to Africa was not part of like this, either I'm going to bring civilization to them or I'm going to get myself rich. No, he just wanted to confront something that would prove to himself, help him prove to himself that I think you were saying that it's his masculinity that he wanted to prove in a way, but the spirit of adventure that maybe at that time young men were um, felt they identified with in a way, and you can explain that because I think you talked about it before. But in any case, so he finds a way to get there, and ironically, even though he kind of thinks women are inferior, they're out of it, they don't understand reality, but it's his aunt who helps him, who connects him to this Belgian company, and then he has to go on this French steamer all around the continent. So he basically starts in, he crosses the channel into Belgium, and then from there takes the French steamer and goes around Africa all the way down to Congo, the area of where the river Congo flows into the sea. Um, so as he's going, by the shore, kind of parallel to the shore, he gets glimpses of the life of the people on the continent that he passes, and and also he witnesses a few fights between some French um, military boat and Africans, and he sometimes sees Africans on boats. And this is one part where he's just kind of contemplating this landscape, very new to him, landscape or seascape, or the sea and the shore. So I put this quote starting with, the voice of the surf heard now and then was a positive pleasure, like the speech of a brother. So he takes comfort in this natural landscape. And he says it was not something natural, that had its reason, now and then a boat from the shore gave one a momentary contact with reality. It was paddled by black fellows. You could see from afar the white of their eyeballs glistening. They shouted, sang, their bodies streamed with perspiration. They had faces like grotesque masks. It says they had bone, muscle, a wild vitality, an intense energy of movement that was as natural and true as the surf along their coast. They wanted no excuse for being there. They were a great comfort to look at. So first he says it's a comfort to see the water, the shore, basically to contemplate nature. And then he says they were part of nature. They were a comfort to look at because they were as alive as nature. And they had a reason, but not more of a reason than nature itself had. So the surf itself is a thing of nature. He just conflates nature with the people who live there. So basically, he robs them of their humanity by saying that he admires them for being so natural and wild, but he doesn't acknowledge that they're human beings. And then as he goes, I mean, in the same fragment here in the same quote, he also mentions how the French steamer is firing into a continent. So further into the comment and to the quote here, in the empty immensity of earth, sky, and water, there she was, she meaning the French boat, the war boat, the man-of-war boat. There she was, incomprehensible, firing into a continent. Pop would go one of the 6-inch guns. The small flame would dart and vanish. A little white smoke would disappear. A tiny projectile would give a feeble screech, and nothing happened. Nothing could happen. Well, what he's talking about here, and this is where we see Conrad's critique of this project of colonialism, which is it the absurdity of this endeavor to try to conquer an entire continent, and to think that your little gun, that your little boat can put a dent into the life of this of an entire continent, basically. So it's hubris. It's completely ego-centered endeavor where a small human beings who live a short life on Earth presume to take over something much bigger than themselves, basically, and they think they can tame, they think they can subdue, control. So that's the colonial purpose there in the jungle, is to think to. It's this belief that if you put your mind to it as a rational, civilized person, you can take control over anything. You can subdue and dominate. So it's this thirst for power that has no bounds. But it's absurd in the end, he thinks. It will never happen. You know, people in one moment in time are not going to dominate the whole course of history of a continent. And the truth is that they don't. I mean, Africa existed before and after colonialism. So, and yes, maybe there was an impact on the culture, but the whole colonial actions that were taken at the time failed in the end, and they failed within less than 100 years. So he's kind of emphasizing the absurdity of this, what they were
Yeah.
trying.
Reading this quote, the pop would go one of the 6-inch guns, a small flame would dart and vanish, a little white smoke would disappear, a tiny projectile would give a feeble screech, and nothing happened. Nothing could happen. I imagine who produced and directed Apocalypse Now. What was his name? I forgot. I'm forgetting his name. But
Francis Coppola.
Yeah, Francis Coppola. Thank you. I imagine I could see how that line itself inspired him to use Heart of Darkness as a backdrop for his movie Apocalypse Now, which, if anyone watching this isn't familiar, Apocalypse Now is about Vietnam that heavily borrows from the narrative of Heart of Darkness. Yeah, pretty amazing. Yeah, is there anything else you wanted to add to this, or do you want me to go to the next slide?
I would like to go one more thing that I had here in the commentary for the quote is that the description of Africans is dehumanizing in itself, because he describes them by their body parts. And if you read the whole text, you can see that this happens over and over again. like later when he sees the chain gang and the people dying, he also describes them through bone and uh, maybe a face, but not a full human being. So yeah, you can go to the next quote if you could, because it's connected in the um,
Is this the one you're thinking of? Black shapes crouched?
yeah. So this contains the contrast that I wanted to talk about. So the black shapes, not people, right? They lay sad between trees, leaning against the trunks, clinging to the earth, half coming out, half effaced within the dim light, in all attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair. So it's almost as if they are one with, like, just like he was saying before, that they are one with the surf. Here he's saying that they're part of the earth, clinging to the earth as if they're one with it, as if they have barely risen above it, but they will go soon back into it. So, and also he acknowledges the pain and suffering that was brought by the Europeans in this kind of the the noble endeavor of work that they were put to, that was kind of enforced upon them. So, but he is, again, Marlowe is not the worst, because he's not there to kill, he's not there to enrich himself, and he doesn't see them as enemies. He says they were not enemies as everybody else says, right? They were not criminals. They were nothing earthly now, nothing but black shadows of disease and starvation. And so, and then the gleam of the eyes is also body parts, describing them by their body parts. Gleam of the eyes, black bone reclined at full length, um, and eyelids rose, sunken eyes looked up at me, enormous and vacant. So it is almost like describing, um, well, not an object, but a thing of nature that is not conscious. And then after this description, he goes into describing this white man that he sees. Um, so he says, I didn't want any more loitering in the shade, and I made haste toward the station. When near the buildings, I met a white man in such an unexpected elegance of get-up that in the first moment I took him for a sort of vision. Then he describes his clothes, which are kind of, I guess maybe he's homesick and it reminds him of home. High starch collar, white cuffs, a light alpaca jacket, snowy trousers, a clean necktie, varnished boots, no hat. And then he says he was amazing and had a pen holder behind his ear. I shook hands with this miracle. So in the moment, he he kind of recognizes the civilized European man in front of him as almost miraculous, because it's a reminder that the world is still there, that even though he thought that he was on a different planet now, one that is prehistorical, that is beyond time, beyond history, um, that suddenly he's reminded that, yes, he's reassured that reality is still there somewhere. He's lost to it right now, but it's somewhere back in Europe waiting for him. So, I mean, again, this contrast plays through the rest of the book. This idea that he is in a place that is not, it doesn't, yes, there are people there, but they don't have a history. They don't have an identity as humans. They don't have, even when he talks about the people on the boat, he doesn't give them names. They don't have names. They're can- cannibals, or it's the helmsman. He's identified by um, his job. So he doesn't see this as whatever there is in the bushes there. It doesn't count as human, because he doesn't grant them all the elements of civilization that he considers um, acceptable. So this is why Chinua Achebe, who wrote the book that is the counterpoint to this book, he wanted to make sure that he showed a rich life with a long history, with wisdom, with a culture that is very complex, and language that contains a lot of wisdom, and very colorful, with a lot of wise sayings. That, so if you want to read these two books side by side, then you'd see why Achebe had this criticism that It's almost as if Africans as humans are not present at all. So because they don't count as people. And Marlowe, again, Marlowe is not Conrad, and people try to make that point that really Marlowe represents Conrad's very um, distorted idea of the Africans, but debated. I mean, some people see Conrad as very critical of colonialism. Other people see him as kind of part of that mentality, and it may be both. I mean, maybe Conrad was very ambivalent and fighting within himself with some of the implicit bias that he had, and he was trying to acknowledge it. Um, but we can move on to the next quote if you want to use a quote too. In the meantime, um,
Um, no, we can go on to the next quote. I'm just thinking who knows what's going on between who's Marlowe and who's Conrad and
yeah.
the criticism Conrad. But at any rate, it is a good literary device to make this story very authentic, because I think this is something that still plagues a lot of Americans. We're kind of isolated from the world, blessed by two oceans surrounding us, so we don't have to deal with the horror and reality of war, even when we engage in war, because it's overseas. And so when we view other people, particularly people we are bombing, it's very easy for us to see the suffering, but still not really embrace the humanity of people that we're engaging in warfare with, or seeing other people engaged in warfare throughout the world. I think that comes from a condition of privilege and a condition of hyper individualism, right? It's not me, it's them, and so I don't really have to worry about it. And so yeah, you can depict people in this way of black shapes and just pointing out their physical features and not identifying of that's a human being over there that's suffering, and that needs to be recognized and acknowledged.
Well, I mean, it's probably even easier to dehumanize the people that you're killing when you're looking at a screen and you just see an explosion, but it doesn't show the suffering that goes with it, that it creates. I mean, even when the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think at first the people who were dropping those bombs thought that it was just beautiful because it was the mushroom cloud and everything, and they just didn't really um, they didn't acknowledge the humanity of the people who died. But later it came back to them in retrospect, and they realized how much damage they had suffered. I think some of them actually maybe committed suicide because of that weighing on their conscience. But
Yeah.
moment in the war situation, for example, I think the first step to being able to kill somebody is to dehumanize the person, to think, okay, it's okay to kill this person, even though I may be Christian, I may be, I know the distinction between good and evil. I know I'm not supposed to kill another human being, but these are not human beings. They're half human, so it's okay. So that was always behind these colonial, the massive colonial destruction that happened. First in the territory of the Americas, the continents, and then Africa and India. It was first make them less than you, and then it's okay because they're exempt the status of don't kill, or killing is, or murder is a sin. Murder is a sin, yeah, except but this is not another human being. So that's kind of how they talk themselves into it, or they reassure themselves that it's not really um, as bad as it looks, and made themselves kind of they made themselves blind to the suffering. But
Yeah.
Marlowe is not blind. I think he is many times ironic, but Con-
Oh, getting a little glitch here again, if you're hearing me. 1 second. Hopefully it comes back in just a second here. But I've lost you for the time being. Oops. And there you are. Okay.
at
Okay.
what point did I? Well, I was just trying to say that
You
that
were
I
just,
people
you
still
left off
debate.
by just saying that Marlowe is not Conrad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
people debate it. I mean, some people see Conrad as very critical of colonialism. Other people see him as kind of part of that mentality. And it may be both. I mean, maybe Conrad was very ambivalent and fighting within himself with some of the implicit bias that he had, and he was trying to acknowledge it. Um, but we can move on to the next quote if you want to use a quote too in the meantime. Um,
No, we can go on to the next quote. I'm just thinking it, who knows what's going on between who's Marlow and who's Conrad and
yeah.
the criticism Conrad. But at any rate, it is a good literary device to make this story very authentic, because I think this is something that still plagues a lot of Americans. We're kind of isolated from the world, blessed by two oceans surrounding us, so we don't have to deal with the horror and reality of war, even when we engage in war, because it's overseas. And so when we view other people, particularly people we are bombing, it's very easy for us to see the suffering, but still not really embrace the humanity of people that we're engaging in warfare with, or seeing other people engaged in warfare throughout the world. I think that comes from a condition of privilege and a condition of hyper individualism, right? It's not me, it's them, and so I don't really have to worry about it. And so yeah, you can depict people in this way of black shapes and just pointing out their physical features and not identifying of that's a human being over there that's suffering, and that needs to be recognized and acknowledged.
Well, I mean, it's probably even easier to dehumanize the people that you're killing when you're looking at a screen and you just see an explosion, but it doesn't show the suffering that goes with it, that it creates. I mean, even when the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think at first the people who were dropping those bombs thought that it was just beautiful because it was the mushroom cloud and everything, and they just didn't really um, they didn't acknowledge the humanity of the people who died. But later it came back to them in retrospect, and they realized how much damage they had suffered. I think some of them actually maybe committed suicide because of that weighing on their conscience. But
Yeah.
moment in the war situation, for example, I think the first step to being able to kill somebody is to dehumanize the person. To think, okay, it's okay to kill this person, even though I may be Christian, I may be, I know the distinction between good and evil. I know I'm not supposed to kill another human being, but these are not human beings; they're half human, so it's okay. So that was always behind these colonial, the massive colonial destruction that happened. It first in the territory of the Americas, the continents, and then Africa and India. It was first make them less than you, and then it's okay because they're exempt the status of don't kill, or killing is, or murder is a sin. Murder is a sin, yeah, except but this is not another human being. So that's kind of how they talk themselves into it, or they reassure themselves that it's not really um, as bad as it looks, and made themselves kind of not they made themselves blind to the suffering. But
Yeah.
Marlow is not blind. I think he is many times ironic.
Oops, we're having a temporary glitch again, so we'll wait until it catches up. I don't know if it helps for me to click things, but there we go. We're back. Okay.
Oh,
So goes the efficiency of technology.
yes.
We're experiencing the heart of darkness right before our eyes. Yeah. I have another quote here. Would you want to comment on this, beginning with restraint?
Yeah, so this is his puzzling, him puzzling over the realization that even though he considered the people who came on the steamboat with them, so Marlow is on a little boat going up the river to find Kurtz. That's pretty much the setup, the context here. And on that boat, there are people so there are a few pilgrims. There's him, there's the manager, and then there are cannibals, what he calls cannibals. And So he's what they do is they throw most of the food that the cannibals brought with them. I mean, they call them the cannibals, but we don't know in what context. They may eat some, maybe
Yeah,
food.
just
It's
real
not
quick, I
explained.
don't know what he's
I
referring
don't
to
know
as
if they are.
cannibals. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's
certainly
just
there is
some.
historical evidence of tribal people engaging in cannibalism, but I think we need to make room for the reality of what cannibalism might be. I mean, if we're going to call these people cannibals, then we should call the first settlers of Jamestown cannibals, right?
And
Or
there, yes.
or the Donner Party cannibals. I probably a lot of what might being observed there is people who were in desperate situations where it was observed they were resorting to cannibalism to
Well,
survive.
during Stalin's rule, Ukrainian people were brought to cannibalism because of the extreme starvation. So there are
Yeah.
times in history when starvation may bring people to use some forms of cannibalism. But what he's noticing is that they're not eating the white people. That's what he's saying. So he's already made up his mind. These are people who eat people.
How
But
nice of
after
these cannibals.
but they're very nice, in fact. And it turns out that even after the white people, we threw overboard their hippo meat, which is what they brought with them to eat. They still didn't eat us. And he says, I don't get it. Like, so this is the quote: restraint. What possible restraint? Was it superstition, disgust, patience, fear, or some kind of primitive honor? No fear can stand up to hunger. No patience can wear it out. Disgust simply does not exist where hunger is. And as to superstition, beliefs, what you may call principles, they're less than chaff in a breeze. So then he says, nothing would withstand, nothing can um, extreme hunger. But he says, and these chaps had no earthly reason for any kind of restraint, of scruple. Restraint, I would just as soon have expected restraint from a hyena prowling amongst the corpses of a battlefield. But there was the fact facing me, the fact dazzling to be seen like the foam on the depths of the sea, like a ripple on an unfathomable enigma. And so basically, it's a big mystery why the so-called cannibals didn't eat the white people, even though they outnumbered them by a lot. And the simplest way for Marlow to decipher this enigma and to find out would be to ask, or would be to have some interaction, communication, to see, not to say, hey, why don't you eat us? But to say, how do you live? How do you see other humans? What are your superstitions? What is your morality based on? But he doesn't make any attempt to understand them as human beings, to see what drives them, what morality they have. And the answer to why they didn't eat them was yes, there was something restraining them. There was a sense of their own morality and honor, and whatever it was, he did not grant it to them. So he preferred to say it's an enigma. I don't know. I don't understand it, but it's there. I know that there is something stopping them, but I don't understand why. And obviously, the main one of the main problems that Marlowe has in this book is his lack of curiosity toward people that he toward an other, toward people who are other from his what he knows. So if he, like the white person that he says, okay, a miracle, see somebody I can understand, but these other creatures, I don't understand them. Therefore, I will leave the wall between us remain in place, even though I'm in their territory. I'm traveling up the river, but I make no attempt to understand them or to communicate with them. So
Yeah,
that's the sad thing about Marlowe's lack of curiosity, at the very
yeah,
least.
he's
To
absolutely encumbered by assumptions. So, he's been brought up as a white person from Europe, and every message that he's been given is that anyone who's not white, particularly Africans, are these people and all of the things that go with their prejudices. And so when he's confronted with the reality, he's almost paralyzed. So much so that, what I was thinking is, yeah, one of the questions he could ask is like, yeah, we had to throw out your hippo meat, but what can we do to feed you guys?
And
He doesn't
in
even,
fact, they pay them in wire, and he does realize, wait a second, what are they supposed to do with this wire? They can't eat the wire. We're not stopping the boat for them to trade the wire for food. So they get hungrier and hungrier, and
yeah.
still they don't eat them. They do have a little piece of root that they eat a little from just to not die. But other than that, the white people are not making much effort to make sure that they're okay, that they can
Yeah, the
survive.
wire, the exchange of wire as a currency really reminds me of the industrial age, the robber baron age, where companies were paying their workers in company script, right? This worthless currency that the corporation had complete control over the value of it. Not only did they have that, but the workers, the coal miners, lived in company towns where they owned their shacks, they owned the stores, and so it was a complete
Right.
farce, this idea that we're paying you for your work. It was just a way of papering over enslaving these people, both the coal miners, in the case of the United States, in places like Western Virginia, and also, as we're seeing here, with these Congolese people.
It was like indented servitude, right? Like an indented. Sorry, I'm messing up the word now. But servitude, indented servitude. That's they couldn't leave those coal mine towns, right? They could not use that currency to travel or to do anything aside from buy within the stores, in the stores of those same towns, right? So they were kind of bound to where
Yeah,
they
in the
lived.
case of West Virginia, it's hard to see because we think of colonialism as going off, leaving your land and going overseas to conquer another people. But clearly, what was going on in West Virginia, those people were living in the Appalachians. These were the Scotch Irish that had lived in those mountains for going back to the mid 1700s. And then with the Industrial Revolution, coal became an important commodity to fuel the Industrial Revolution. And so those coal companies just moved in there and stripped them of their land. They were just living there. No one owned any land. They didn't have deeds to land. So they just took their land, stripped the mountains, and basically said, well, now if you want to eat and live in a home, a shack, you're going to have to work for us. And so it was a kind of papering over of colonialism and slavery, and calling it free labor, and basically saying that you're going to build yourself up if you work and maybe save some money, and then you too can own a coal company one of these days, right? But
But
that's
this
an
is, I
aside.
guess, the universal way to make quick money to enrich yourself is find others to work for you while you take the resources and give them very little. This is a strategy that works today in human trafficking, like the promises to give them a job, including people smuggled from other countries into the United States. Right? They're given a promise of a job, and then they're bound to that job, and their passports are taken, and they're told, you have to pay for me bringing you here, so you have to work um, first to pay off what you owe me, and then you're gonna make money, but your own money. So it's basically slavery, but it's called work. It's called employment. But in fact, there are many ways in which today still to this day we have forms of slavery because
Yeah, it really points to the importance of having democratic institutions. I don't think people fully appreciate that democracy and capitalism are like oil and vinegar. Certainly the two can coexist, but if we want humanity to be the forefront of society, we really need to put an emphasis on democratic institutions over capital.
and
It certainly
protecting
doesn't.
human
Yeah.
rights, right?
Yeah, I mean, all of that is encumbered in the idea of democratic institutions. Certainly, capital is great, making money is great, but not at the expense of causing untold misery. Real quick, I know, Liliana, you have a hard out, so could you remind me of that time? What time do you have to be done?
I have about 15 more minutes.
Okay, you did mention before we started recording, you did want to address the role of women depicted by Joseph Campbell in this book. So if you wanted to touch on that before we have to call it quits today.
Um,
Did you want to share? I'll stop sharing if you wanted to share your
yeah,
screen.
I just have the text itself, the entirety of Heart of Darkness, but I I put it in a place where, okay, so to backtrack a little bit, Marlow states from the beginning that he thinks women can't comprehend reality, that they should be left out of it, and then he says, Charlie Marlow had to ask a woman for help. So we can see that his attitude toward women is that, of course, is of superiority, um, and it's part of the patriarchal Victorian society that he's raised in. But so I'm not going to go to his interactions with white women, but I'm going to go to the one description of an African woman um, that he hasn't. Let me see where do I. Okay, so this is it's a description of Kurtz's mistress. So Kurtz is dying, and we got to the point where Kurtz is he actually encountered Kurtz, um, and he does have a fiance back in Europe, but back in actually in England. But here he has a mistress, an African mistress. So the description of this woman is in complete contrast to the description of the intended, which I will go to after this to show the contrast between these two women. So in this middle of this page, she walked with measured steps, draped in striped and fringed cloths, treading the earth proudly with a slight jingle and flash of barbarous ornaments. She carried her head high. Her hair was done in the shape of a helmet. She had brass leggings to the knee, brass wire gauntlets to the elbow, a crimson spot on her tawny cheek, innumerable necklaces of glass beads on her neck. So it's a description of how she's adorned. But then he says she was savage and superb, wild-eyed and magnificent. There was something ominous and stately in her deliberate progress, and in the hush that had fallen suddenly upon the whole sorrowful land, the immense wilderness, the colossal body of the fecunded, mysterious life seemed to look at her pensive, as though it had been looking at the image of its own tenebrous and passionate soul. So this, she still seems to be part of the landscape, but it's more than that. I mean, he gives her, she has an identity that is above everybody else, right? Her identity is like royalty within her people. He kind of, maybe she is some kind of a queen there. It's not clear, but he says she carried her head high. The hair was done in the shape of a helmet, almost as if she's a warrior, like a warrior princess or something like that. Um, and he still calls her savage and wild-eyed, but she has more authority, more autonomy, more agency. It seems at least he kind of grants her certain power, even over him. Like he's kind of in awe of her. Um, so, and still he can communicate with her, and she's basically there trying to persuade them not to take Kurtz away. But it's almost as if he faces the reality that these people have their own rationale, their own structure of power, their own hierarchy. And a woman who has a position, a status in her society that gives her power. So she has more, she basically, he calls her stately. So she's a person of high status. And to him, that's another mystery, another incomprehensible fact, which he is not used to. He's not used to seeing women having this kind of power. In his society, they don't. So if I go to the very end where he's talking to the intended, which is Kurtz's fiance, he has complete condescension for her. So he's basically, she asks for his last words, and And she keeps saying how Kurtz is amazing, how Kurtz is, um, this is the intended speaking. She says, he drew men towards him and was by what was best in him, in them. She looked at me with intensity. It is the gift of the great, she went on. So from the things that she says about Kurtz, it seems that she has no idea what he was doing there in the jungle, that he was being basically a monster, exploiting and killing people. Um, so, in fact, when it's all ironic, right? We, the reader, know that the readers know that Kurtz was actually a horrible person, but she is innocent, so she's completely in the dark in relation to who Kurtz really was. But he could tell her, he could educate her on what Kurtz actually was doing or who he was. But when she begs him to give her something to remember Kurtz by, and she says, "Don't you understand? I loved him. I loved him." Uh, because she asks for his last words, because he happened to mention that he was there with him when he died. So she says, he says, "I heard his very last words." And then she says, "Repeat them." She murmured in a heartbroken tone, "I want something to live with." And at that point, I was on the point of crying at her. "Don't you hear them?" His last words were the horror, which basically, horror is the last comment Kurtz has on the whole, his own life. It's kind of his conclusion at the end of his own life, that maybe that he was the horror, maybe that colonialism was the horror. But in any case, it's kind of an admission of guilt in a way. But he doesn't want to tell his fiancée that Kurtz was the horror. So instead, he says his last words that he pronounced was your name. So
Mm.
this is where we see Marlow not granting women the ability to understand the man's world, because it is a man's world. So she sighs and she says, "I knew, I was sure." She knew, she was sure. It's a very condescending comment on her. Um, but just to let me stop sharing, because I want to comment a little bit on that to give Conrad the benefit of the doubt in relation to women. Did I stop the sharing?
Yes.
Okay. So to me, this shows that in Conrad's interpretation, I believe that what he's saying is that women are not by nature unable to understand reality. Their society, Victorian English society, has kept them in a childlike state. So people like Marlowe have protected women from the truth of the world, from reality. Just like we see Marlowe refuse to tell the intended who Kurtz really was, or his last words. But a woman who's given by her own society the ability to lead, the ability to comprehend. And we see an example in the African queen, or the African uh, mistress, that seems in her own society. In a society where women can or are given positions of power, they can handle it, right? So maybe this is a comment from Conrad on his own society, who keeps women in a kind of subservient, objectified, childish position. So it's possible also that this is a criticism that Conrad addresses his own society, that people like Marlowe, again, Conrad could have written the story as himself, but he chose a character. He chose to create a character. So we never assume that the character is the same as the writer, right? Or the narrator is the same as the writer. So I think this is an example where we see Conrad being a different voice than that of the character. So I think Marlowe is, in fact, blinded by his patriarchal society, and he doesn't want to grant women their ability to be part of the man's world, to be equal to man. But Conrad probably would have, if given the chance. If he lived in our society, he probably would have been fine with women being in positions of power. So I mean, it's still an ambivalent hard to tell exactly what Conrad meant by it, but we do have a contrast of a woman with power and a woman who is powerless in the
Oops,
men.
lost you.
So
Starting to break up a bit.
that was my
Okay, no, we're back.
oh,
The
okay.
the thing I was thinking too of to give credence to the fact that we have two separate actual entities here, a Conrad and Marlow. The fact that his aunt helped him and still Marlow condescends and looks down at this person who is helping him, who has the power to help him. If this really was the voice of Conrad, I'm sure he might have used an uncle to help him rather than this woman, right? So, but who knows? Um, and yeah, you know what just strikes me, this notion that women can't accept and ingest hard realities. So instead of sharing the last words, the horror, which is really troubling to hear the last words of a person, the horror. I mean, that's not the ideal way to go out. And instead he said your name. Isn't that sweet? Um, it kind of reminds me of, well, it's an ongoing problem. It's definitely not a problem of mine, but the inability for men to be vulnerable about in front of women, or with anybody for that matter, but especially women, I think is something that is some us, the modern reader, can kind of appreciate of what perhaps Conrad is trying to impart, that this heart of darkness isn't just an indictment on colonialism, on the Enlightenment, but it really is something for us to look at, that if you can't accept women to be just human beings who have the same essential qualities as a human being as any man does, certainly there are biological differences, but it doesn't obscure the basic humanity, then it's not just hurting women, it's also hurting men, because the inability to be vulnerable in front of those that are closest to you really constrains one's life. You're not able to express, yeah, this is what I need, this is what I don't need in life, this is how I feel, this is how I don't, all of that kind of stuff. And it just cuts you off from the magic and the juice of life, to many.
And it puts unnecessary pressure on men too, right? To
Yeah.
think to believe this belief that there's an expectation of them to perform as men or in a manly way, when in fact many might want to express themselves in other ways, like for example use emotion to create art or things like that. And so it seems that maybe even Marlowe feels frustrated in a way that part of reality is cut off from him. And he many times he says, well, it's a mystery. So even the African queen, well, I acknowledge there's a presence here that I could maybe try to understand, but I give up. I don't have the means to understand it. So it's almost like part of reality is closed off to him. And he could, if he wanted to inquire further and understand a different culture, understand a different gender. But he remains in his bubble. And maybe that's part of the reason why at the end we see him quite depressed, I think, because at the end everything is darkness. Like even when he talks to the intended, and he still condescends to her, but at the same time he sees there's something that escapes him. Like there's a mystery in reality, that it's a darkness that is deepening while when he's back in England. Maybe part of him remains a little um, unsatisfied with the whole experience, that he went there, but what did he get out of it? Except he saw that there was a white man doing horrible things. But has he learned anything about Africa itself? And maybe at the end, I mean, he's a young man, but as he starts maturing, maybe he will start maybe he will see things differently as an adult, and looking back he will start comprehending what he didn't understand before. Even this mystery of Africans, maybe he'll have some regret not reaching out and trying to talk to them as people or to see them as people, because it's a missed opportunity. Anything that we close ourselves to is a missed opportunity, and our relationships, our society, the meeting of two civilizations, it all, you only learn from it if you're open to a change in even in yourself, because communicating with others means that you might start seeing yourself differently. So I'm just saying that it's a shame for Marlowe that he kind of didn't learn much from his experience, except yes, he probably had an adventure, but in the end things remain mysterious to him. But today we're trying to be less closed-minded when we communicate with other cultures, right? At least there's an effort from us in our contemporary world to grant humanity, maybe too much sometimes to people who don't uh, earn maybe this, I guess, the trust we put in them. So we always have to watch out for people who may try to hurt, and we grant them too much humanity. But see, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Sometimes with human beings, it's hard. We want to trust in people, but at the same time, some people still want just to accumulate and just to hurt other people. So I guess this is
Yeah.
a, Marlowe did learn that some people that he considered the epitome of civilization are actually horrible human beings that were granted too much power.
Yeah, and I think the kind of looking back on this book, it's published, I believe, in 1899, which is really interesting because he's providing a narrative that really is pessimistic. But at this time, if you were to go back in time, you would have heard huge degrees of optimism being expressed, scientific discoveries, the explosion of technology, the spreading of wealth within European and American societies, the accumulation of wealth, I should probably say. But what's happening 15 years after this book is being published? World War I, right? Which marks the end, the beginning of the end of Western civilization, in which
And
we
the
are
Western
still,
idealism, right?
yeah. And the
Belief in
end, really the end of any kind of idea of enlightened principles, and the beginning of the postmodern age, which has caused all sorts of interesting issues. But
But Conrad already, I think he was ahead of his time in a way, because
yeah, that's
I
what
think
I'm
he
trying
was
to
already
indicate.
disappointed. Yeah. But
Mhm.
let's not forget that he was actually Polish, that he had come from Poland, and he had seen the Russian Empire kind of destroy. So he already had seen the darkness in humanity. So he was already disenchanted with the idea of civilization and empire. And then he comes to England and he sees maybe echoes of the same things he witnessed as a younger person. So I find it hard to believe that he would be condoning empire. He's probably just expressing his disenchantment with it through this book,
It's
which
coming
is
for
the
everyone.
darkness of us all.
Yeah.
So the heart of
Okay.
darkness is not Africa, I think. I think the title is ironic.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Look within, look within. Okay, Leanna, I know you have to get to a class to teach some worthy students, so I'll let you go, and
Okay.
I'll try to get
Well,
this
thank you.
out. I'm going to do a little bit of editing, so I'll try to get this out
Sure.
by Friday to you, so you can share it with your students. Okay, so take care. Have a good day.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'll leave then the bye.
Bye.
my only friend, the end of our elaborate plans, the end of everything that stands, the end, no safety or surprise, the end. I'll never look into your eyes again.